going to be finishing up our series on relationships we're calling Closer at what I think might be one of the top reasons that we experience miscommunication with others. But before giving away the topic, I hope that you've enjoyed the series as much as I have. You all understand, as the one who gives the message, I have to wrestle with it the whole week before I preach it. And I feel like a fraud if I were to not actually try to live it out. And I hope that you're trying to do those same things. So I want to just recap what we've looked at as we've gone through this series so far. First, we looked at that we are wired for relationship. God is a relational God, and we need relationships. We can't just live this busy, task-oriented life, cutting out spending time with other people. And then we talked about being open to others. It was a message on hospitality, that we are to open our homes and our hearts to the stranger, to those who are different than us. Being nice to everyone, biblically speaking. Everybody knows that we're supposed to be nice, but we don't get to pick and choose who we are nice to. When the person asks Jesus, who is my neighbor? And Jesus tells the story of the hated Samaritan. We have to understand that our ability to be kind and caring has to extend to all people in all situations. We talked about needing to forgive. Jesus says that his Father will withhold forgiveness from us if we fail to forgive one another. And so we have to be people of forgiveness who overlook offense sometimes. And then last week we talked about establishing and maintaining healthy boundaries and how some people are walked on all the time and they need to set up boundaries, and other people are the ones who are doing the walking on top of, and they need to learn to respect others' boundaries. And when we do that, we have much healthier relationships. But to today's topic at hand, if any of you are like me, there's been countless situations where you are arguing with somebody and you end up at a point where you don't even remember how you got into the argument. You just remember that there was probably a minor issue, and then you made some assumption about what they were feeling or thinking or why they said what they said or why they did what they did. And so you got offended and you became defensive, and the whole thing escalated, and all of a sudden the bell rang, ding, ding, and the fight was on, and you're in this full-blown argument that might be over absolutely nothing except for a miscommunication. A while back, I had this experience in ministry. A good friend of mine, I was working in youth with her, and she was a youth leader of mine, and I'd asked her to do something for me, and then I got word back to me that she was doing something completely different than what I had asked her to do. And instantly in my mind, I'm like, why is she not taking the instructions I gave her? It was real simple. I just needed this and this while I was out. Now she's doing that. Does she not like how I'm doing youth? And I started telling myself a story real quickly about all these things. And my wife got tired hearing about it eventually. I was using words like never and people always do this. And when you start saying they never do that and they always do this, you know you're to a bad spot. So my wife said, Ryan, just call her. And I was being a baby, and I was like, no, I don't want to. But she's strong. God gave me a strong woman. That was by design. And she's like, Ryan, you need to. So I make the call. And guess what? The whole thing was a big miscommunication. I was misreading the situation. I'd heard a little bit of information that wasn't completely accurate. She wasn't even set on what she was planning on doing. And so we had a lovely conversation. I apologized and said, I'm sorry for thinking the worst of you. I should know better. And she said, that's quite all right. I'm glad you made the call to straighten things up before it became a bigger issue. And I tell you this story because I think it exemplifies what happens so often in our own lives. We tell ourselves a story, and what we're doing is we are assuming the worst about other people. So this message today is that we have got to stop assuming the worst about people who are on our team. And the thing is, I know that I'm not the only one who makes these crazy jumps in our mind about our friends or maybe our spouses, coworkers, people that we serve at church with. The list goes on and on. It's as though in the moment of miscommunication, we forget all the goodwill and the strength of the relationship that we've built up with these other people. Like if your spouse comes home and they've had a bad day and they just say a snippy word, we're so quick to jump to, oh, she's always like that, going to be on my case. And we start saying how terrible this situation is, when really the whole thing was they had a bad day. And they came back and they said something, yeah, maybe they shouldn't have said it, but it's not because they hate you. It's not because they think these terrible things. We've got to stop jumping into those stories that we tell ourselves. And the reason I know I'm not the only one who experiences this is because it's just part of human nature. It's part of being in relationships with others in this broken, sin-infested world. We see it all the way back in Genesis chapter 3. Adam and Eve sin, and they immediately hide from God. Why did they hide? Because they were probably making some assumptions about exactly what God was going to do to them. Jesus tells us he wants us to come to him to ask for forgiveness. Adam and Eve run from God. They're assuming he's probably going to smite them, kill them, something terrible, so they're trying to get away. The best example, I think, that we see where someone has to deal with driving a wedge in a relationship because of making an assumption is actually found in Joshua chapter 22. I remember I was wrestling with this concept in talking with some people of assuming the worst about others while I was reading through my Bible in a year. And I got to Joshua 22 and I was like, this is the perfect analogy to what we do in our lives all the time. So that's where we're going to go, to this little-known Old Testament story to drive the point home. But before we get there, I need to give you guys a little background knowledge on Joshua chapter 22 and what's happened so far. So Moses leads the Israelites out of Egypt, right? They cross the Red Sea, they wander in the wilderness for 40 years, and then God says, okay, it's time to go into the promised land. And on their way to the promised land, they're going up the east side of the Jordan River, and they're having to defeat several kings and kingdoms on the east side of the Jordan River. And before they get to the point where they need to cross the river, the 2.5 tribes, Manasseh was a son of Joseph, so he's considered a half tribe. They say, we actually like the land over here a lot. Can we just stay on the east side of the Jordan River, and then there'll be fewer of us or fewer of you all to fill the west side of the Jordan River? And Moses and Joshua at that point says, yeah, that's fine, but you have to come and fight alongside us as we clear through the land of Canaan to make this promised land a place for us to live. And so that's what the book of Joshua chronicles then. As you go through Joshua, you're seeing all these battles with different peoples, going through cities like Jericho, knocking down the walls, taking over the land. And when you get to the very end of the book of Joshua, that's where we find ourselves right now in Joshua 22, where these 2.5 tribes have decided, okay, we've done the fighting, it's time for us to return home. So verses 1 through 5 first in chapter 22. Then Joshua summoned the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, and said to them, you have done all that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded, and you've obeyed me in everything I commanded. For a long time now, to this very day, you have not deserted your fellow Israelites, but have carried out the mission the Lord your God gave you. Now that the Lord your God has given them rest, as he promised, return to your homes in the land that Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you on the other side of the Jordan. But be very careful to keep the commandment and the law that Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you, to love the Lord your God, to walk in obedience to him, to keep his commands, to hold fast to him, and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul. So basically, Joshua is telling them, guys, job well done. Thank you for your service. We've accomplished everything that we need. You can punch out, you're off the clock, go home, but remember to keep this covenant with God, serving him with all your heart and soul. Then we jump down to verse 9 in the story. So the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh left the Israelites at Shiloh in Canaan to return to Gilead, their own land. When they came to Gilalath, near the Jordan, they built an imposing altar there by the Jordan. And when the Israelites heard that they had built the altar, The whole assembly of Israel gathered at Shiloh to go to war against them. Do any of you guys hear how fast this thing turned on a dime? Right after being reminded to only worship God, they go and build this huge, imposing altar. The rest of the Israelites, the ones who were just fighting shoulder to shoulder with them, are like, all right, grab your swords and your shields. We're off to civil war now with you. This whole thing, they go from, look at what we did together, to, now we're going to have to go and kill you all. Like, wow, in just a couple sentences, this entire thing completely turns on a dime. But what we see is that the 10 tribes of Israel are making a whole bunch of assumptions about this altar, aren't they? So we pick up the story in verse 16 through 18. The whole assembly of the Lord says, how could you break faith with the God of Israel like this? Yeah, let me keep going. How could you turn away from the Lord and build yourselves an altar in rebellion against him now? Was not the sin of Peor enough for us? Up to this very day we have not cleansed ourselves from that sin, even though a plague fell on the community of the Lord. And are you now turning away from the Lord? If you rebel against the Lord today, tomorrow he will be angry with the whole community of Israel. So do you see the story they told themselves? They sent their Phinehas the priest and one leader from each of the 10 tribes, and they get there and they tell them, what you're doing is you're going to bring a curse from God on us by building this altar. It's going to be like that day with Peor, and that was a moment when some people turned and they made themselves an idol, a Baal, and God wiped out 24,000 Israelites as the consequence. And so these tribes are saying, what are you guys doing? By building this, you're going to bring destruction on us. We keep going in verse 21. Then Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh replied to the heads of the clans of Israel, No. We did it for fear that someday your descendants might say to ours, what do you have to do with the Lord, the God of Israel? The Lord has made the Jordan a boundary between us, and you Reubenites and Gadites, you have no share with us in the Lord. That is why we said, let us get ready and build an altar, but not for burnt offerings or sacrifices. No, on the contrary, it's to be a witness between us and you and the generations that follow, that we will worship the Lord. Then in the future, your descendants will not be able to say to ours, you have no share in the Lord. And we said, if they ever say this to us or to our descendants, we will answer, look at the replica of the Lord's altar, which our ancestors built, not for burnt offerings and sacrifices, but as a witness between us and you. Do you see how now we're getting to the truth? Rather than just going straight to war, Phinehas the priest and a leader from each of the tribes, they go and they show up and they say, we think you did this. And then the tribes of the Reubenites, Gadites, and Manasseh say, no, that's not what we were doing at all. We made an assumption that you guys were going to forget about us and that we were going to just be seen as other nations for you to maybe conquer who don't have a part with you at all. And so they were both making assumptions about one another. Now let's look at how this whole thing finally comes to resolution in verse 30. When Phinehas the priest and the leaders of the community, the heads of the clans of the Israelites, heard what Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh had to say, they were pleased. So they returned home, they reported to the Israelites everything that had happened, and in verse 33, they were glad to hear the report and praised God. Now, we may shake our heads at this story. It's an awkward story. As I was reading through it that one time, I thought, they're all fighting together through all of the end of Deuteronomy and through the book of Numbers and then through the book of Joshua. You see them all fighting shoulder to shoulder. And in a sentence, they're ready to go to war with one another. And we can shake our heads and say, that seems absolutely crazy. But that is so us. We do that exact same thing so quickly. When somebody who we're friends with says something that just cuts really deep, and yes, it may be a hurtful word, but we instantly assume that there's hate in their heart, or there's a reason that they're out to get us. And sometimes it's just not being careful with their words, or that they had a bad day, or that, yeah, they're upset about some small thing. But what we're doing is we're allowing small things to become really big things. Maybe you've been in the church foyer and you saw somebody and you waved and they turned around and they walked away and you're like, what did I do to them? And you get all upset and worked up and you're racking your mind for why that person's mad at you when really they just didn't see you. Like, those things happen, and we make assumptions and we tell ourselves a story so often, and we allow ourselves to decide that that person is not our friend, but they're our foe. You see, I think Satan, our enemy, loves to watch us doubt one another and create conflict where none exists. I think that that's a primary tactic of the enemy, is that he loves to create conflict where none exists, where very small things get made into very big things. And we end up inflicting this pain on ourselves because we're not secure enough in the other person's care and love for us. We assume the worst because we doubt. We don't fully trust, or maybe because we've been hurt before, and that's now what we assume of everybody else. But God wants so much more for us. He wants us to be free from the doubt and the insecurity that plagues us and causes us to have all these negative assumptions. He wants us to enjoy these relationships and be blessed by them and by the people that he's put into our lives. And so we need to find a way to get beyond our negative assumptions of others. We have to move beyond past hurts and times that people have broken our trust and stop carrying that into every future relationship in our lives. So what should you do when you think there's been a miscommunication, or you feel yourself starting to make assumptions about somebody else that aren't the most kind? The first thing you have to do is you have to address the situation. You have to set up the conversation, and it's uncomfortable. I'm not going to lie. Nobody's like, yeah, I want to have that hard conversation. But just like our need to forgive so that offense doesn't take root in our hearts, you can't let conflict fester, or it's only going to get worse. And you're going to keep telling yourself a bigger and worse story about how much this person doesn't like you, or how they're out to hurt you or harm you. You're going to continue adding to your wrong assumptions. So you simply have to step into it and begin the conversation. Just like the Israelites sent the high priest over to say, what have you done? That's what we need to do. Next, we have to share both sides of the story. And this can be really challenging, but both people need to feel like they can share safely what they have perceived from their side. The 10 tribes said, you're trying to build an altar to worship God, and God's going to strike us dead. And the other said, you're going to forget about us because we live on the other side of the river. And both of them go, oh, I understand why you see it that way. I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry. All right. Thank you, Jesus. We need to be willing to get both sides of the story out there. This is not the time to be defensive, but to just humbly say, this is what I've seen, what I've observed, how I feel. What do you think? And then they can share their side. Next, you get to feel a little bit of relief from the clarity. Now that the tension has been resolved and the assumptions are swept away, both of you hopefully feel a little bit better about the relationship. And you realize that they're not out to get you and they're not out to get you. And you're able to say, this is a miscommunication. Or maybe here's where the issue is, but then you can talk about the actual issue and not all the feelings and weird behaviors that get added into it. It allows you to both prove that you can be trusted and you can be honest and try to work it out together. And I love the final step that's included in verse 33. We praise God. We don't just walk away and go, whew, problem averted. But we say, God, thank you for helping us reconcile and restore this relationship. What the enemy was trying to break apart, you've allowed us to step in with love and with clarity so that we can restore this relationship to what it's supposed to be. And so we thank him when it's all cleared up. I know I've walked through this process many times in my life. I've become a bit of an expert because I tend to make negative assumptions about people. There's one time I remember real clearly with a staff member, Amy, who led in the hymn sing. Lovely, sweet lady. We had a great friendship, but for like a week, things got off. And she was just being terse and snarky with me, and I didn't know why. And so I got snarky back with her. I wasn't going to take it. And so I was giving her little jabs. And eventually I realized, okay, this can't go on. Our work relationship isn't being very fun right now. Our friendship isn't being very strong right now. So I just went into her office and I closed the door. And I simply said, our relationship just feels off. And I don't know why. But I want to clear it up. Because I don't want to make assumptions. I don't really know what's going on your side, and I know I'm just being defensive, and it's not good. And we were able to have a conversation and realize that it was just hurt feelings over nothing. And we were able to give each other a big hug. Amy loves to hug. She's a giant hugger. Tate knows that. He's nodding his head over there. He worked with her for several years. And we were able to move beyond it, and our friendship grew much deeper. And when we had these run-ins in the future, we were able to much quicker be like, you don't actually mean that. No, I don't mean that. Well, I'm sorry if that offended you. And we were able to deal with it. But Satan was trying to drive a wedge in there of miscommunication and negative assumptions. And we have to, as Christians, recognize that that's a story, that's a temptation that's being lodged into our mind. And we have to sweep it away, go to the person, and get to the root of it. So I think one of the big issues in why this happens is because so often when we're working with these people or these relationships are being a struggle, we have forgotten that this person is on my team. So this concept of who's on your team is something that Michelle and I were trained in as we did foster care, okay? So when you work with foster care kids, you're trying to tell them over and over, look, your foster parents are on your team, your real parents are on your team, the DHS worker's on your team, the therapist is on your team, the principal and the teacher are on your team, because to the kid, they just have a million people involved in their lives, and they're getting moved around and passed around, and they feel like they're all on their own. And so you're continually saying, no, we're on your team, we're trying to help you. But to that child, they don't realize that, and they don't see it that way. The same thing happens when we're in conflict with people. We very quickly forget who's on our team, and we start making them our enemy rather than our friend. And so when we're in the middle of conflict, we have to soak in these next three statements and remind ourselves of who is on our team. And the first is, it's your family. Your family and your spouse are on your team. Your kids are on your team. Your parents are on your team. Yes, both of them are from a different generation. Your kids are from the younger generation, or if you've got your parents around, they're from the older generation. They see things differently. They think differently about things. They're going to say things that maybe are going to step on your toes. It happens in every single family. But it doesn't mean that they don't love you, that they're mad at you, that they're angry at you, that they spite you and they're trying to hurt you. You have to say, no, they're on my team. They love me, and we need to work through this. This is especially true of your spouse. He or she may say things that bug you or make you feel challenged, but don't assume the worst and instantly jump to retaliation. Instead, you need to address it early. Talk about it. Or another option is to simply overlook the offense and say, I know that that's not what she really thinks, so I'm not going to let that arrow lodge in my heart. I'm just going to let it go and keep moving on. That's just an out-of-place comment, and I'm going to keep going. Those are all our choices of what we can do using the skills we've learned in this series, but saying, my family members are on my team. They're not trying to hurt me. Next, your church family is on your team. This is what makes church different from the world. We are all to show the love of Jesus to one another. We're to be a picture of unity in a fractured, fighting world. And yes, we may disagree about how to do things or how to handle situations, but we cannot forget that by being a part of the family of God, we are teammates. We all have the same goal. And that goal is that as many people as possible find peace in a relationship with Jesus Christ. So rather than going around people or backbiting on people if somebody says something that offends you, we need to be people of unity who say, I know they're on my team. And we need to be people who go and address situations if we feel like they're going sideways. But we can't assume the worst and retaliate. We have to let unity lead as we talk through our differences. And finally, and for some people this is the hardest, you have to remember that your God is on your team. For some people, they see God as like this judge on a throne with lightning bolts in his hands, and he's waiting for you to mess up to just throw them down at you and smite you right there. I mean, this is Adam and Eve, and then they run and they hide from God. And so some people, they make a major mess up, and the first thing they do is, we don't see him at church. They hide from God by not coming around the church. And what they're doing essentially is they're saying, I don't feel safe. I don't feel like God's on my team. Rather than running to God and saying, God, I messed up. I screwed up. I'm sorry. Forgive me. They run away from God and they say, I just don't want to deal with it. They see God as this vengeful judge rather than the loving Father who just wants to wrap his arms around you and say, look, come to me. I forgive you. I love you. I want better for you. God created each one of us for relationship with him and relationship with one another. But part of our sinful nature is that we make these relationships a lot more challenging than they ought to be. We create mountains out of molehills. And then, like the Israelites, we start a civil war against those that we've triumphed in war alongside just weeks before. We allow our insecurities and doubts to lead us into all sorts of negative assumptions. It steals our joy and it strains our perfectly healthy relationships. But God wants more for us than that. He wants us to know how to deal with these situations when they rear their ugly heads rather than letting them fester. And he wants us to trust that our family and our church family and our God is on our team. They are here to help us, not to tear us down. So let's stop assuming the worst of them. I can't wait till we all get to heaven and we find relationships are so much easier. When all of our sin is gone, all of our pride is gone, and relationships flow in perfect harmony. But while we live in this fallen world with our sin and other people's sin affecting how we behave, we have got to be very intentional in how we build our relationships. We have to be intentional to resolve conflict and to maintain boundaries, to overlook offense and to offer forgiveness, and to welcome strangers in and among us. We, as followers of Jesus, are called to be peacemakers, to be reconcilers, and to demonstrate to the world the life-giving benefit of community. This is not something where we live all on our own, but we have been taught we live as a community. And I want that type of community for myself. I want strong relationships like that in the here and the now. And that's why we have to put these practices, or we have to put these skills that we've been going through in this series into practice so that we can be a church of love and of forgiveness and of peace. So will you join me in putting this series into practice so that we together can experience the type of community that Jesus desires for every single one of us? Would you bow your heads with me?